The strongest fortress in Europe was defended by 57 elderly gunners, and in February 1916, the German army knew exactly where to strike. Fort Douaumont, the anchor of Verdun's citadel ring, had been quietly stripped of nearly everything that made it dangerous. In August 1915, Joffre's headquarters had watched the great Belgian forts of Liège and Namur crumble under German siege guns and drawn a sweeping conclusion. Fixed fortifications were obsolete. Verdun's forts lost most of their artillery, their garrisons, their purpose. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. From the trenches at Bois des Courets, Colonel Émile Driant, a serving deputy as well as a soldier, wrote to Parliament in late 1915 that Verdun's defenses were dangerously weak. His warnings were brushed aside. Across the lines, hidden in the winter woods, Erich von Falkenhayn, chief of the German General Staff, was massing the Fifth Army under Crown Prince Wilhelm with more than 10,200 guns concentrated on an 8-mile front. Falkenhayn would later claim he never intended a breakthrough at all, only attrition, a killing ground where France would bleed itself white on soil it could not abandon. But what no one on either side yet understood, what would turn on a single day's difference in a single order, was that the fortress France had disarmed was about to become the hinge of the entire war. At dawn on February 21, 1916, the heaviest bombardment yet seen on the Western Front fell on the right bank of the Meuse. The Germans called the operation Gericht, judgment. For 9 hours, shells of every caliber erased whole woods from the map, buried trenches with the men still in them, and cut every telephone line running back to General Frederick Herr's headquarters in Verdun. Then the infantry came forward, probing with flamethrowers and storm detachments. At Bois des Courets, Driant's chasseurs held for 2 days against odds no one had planned for. On February 22nd, Driant himself was killed, covering the withdrawal of his survivors. The man who had warned Parliament, dead, proving himself right. French brigades to either side disintegrated. Villages fell. The line bent back toward the forts that could no longer defend it. And in Verdun, exactly as in our own timeline, Herr's exhausted staff began drafting the unthinkable, plans to abandon the right bank of the Meuse entirely, forts and all, and stand behind the river. In our history, that order was never executed. Here, it was. This is where the timeline breaks. In reality, the authorization to withdraw hovered over Herr's headquarters until the night of February 24 to 25, when General Noël de Castelnau, Joffre's chief of staff, raced to Verdun and decided the right bank would be held. In this timeline, the authorization arrives a single day early, on February 24th, before de Castelnau can leave Chantilly. Herr, his front collapsing and his communications in ruins, executes it. Through the night, the skeleton garrisons of the fort line file out into the snow, spiking what few guns remain. On the afternoon of February 25, men of the 24th Brandenburg Regiment, the same regiment that in our history captured Douaumont from its 57 territorials almost without a shot, climb through the wire and find the fort not merely undermanned, but empty. In our timeline, they stopped, consolidated, and the battle congealed around the lost fort for 10 months. Here, there is nothing to congeal around. The Brandenburgers stand on the highest ground of the whole battlefield and see French columns streaming down the ridge toward the Meuse bridges. They follow. The road to Verdun is open, and the consequences of that open road would prove catastrophic. But to understand how catastrophic, we have to watch the one man who might have stopped it arrive too late. Philippe Pétain reached Souilly on February 26 with orders to take over the defense with his Second Army staff. In our history, he arrived to a crisis. In this one, he arrives to a collapse. The fort line is gone. German heavy batteries are already registering on the Meuse crossings, and the single light railway and the narrow road from Bar-le-Duc, the artery that in another world would be organized into the Voie Sacrée, a continuous conveyor of trucks, now carry traffic the other way. Pétain is a soldier of cold arithmetic, and the arithmetic is finished. He cannot rebuild a fortified front on open ground under observation from Douaumont's ridge. What he can do is save the army, And he does. Rear guards at the bridges, guns dragged back by night. The garrison extracted division by division to the left bank. In the first days of March, troops of the Crown Prince's Fifth Army enter Verdun itself, a burning, evacuated shell of a city, its citadel abandoned, its cathedral square silent. The fortress France had sworn to hold at any price has fallen in a week, at almost no German cost. Falkenhayn, the apostle of attrition, has been handed the one thing his strategy never asked for, a victory. The guns had barely stopped before the reckoning began in Paris. Premier Aristide Briand's government, under President Raymond Poincaré, faced a chamber of deputies that wanted names, and the name it wanted most was Joffre. The dead Driant's warnings were read aloud on the floor. The August 1915 order stripping the forts was dragged into the light. Joffre, the victor of the Marne, the man whose calm had steadied France in 1914, became overnight the man who had disarmed Douaumont. Briand made the only political calculation available. He sacrificed the commander-in-chief to save the government. De Castelnau assumed overall command, with Pétain holding the new line on the left bank of the Meuse, and holding it consumed everything. Divisions were stripped from Champagne, from the Vosges, and decisively from the build-up in Picardy. The Chantilly Conference of December 1915 had committed France and Britain to a joint offensive astride the Somme in mid-1916. That commitment died in March, division by division, as the French half of the offensive marched east instead. Douglas Haig's staff watched their partner dissolve. What they did about it would become Britain's hardest question of the war. But first, the French army itself began to break. In April and May, de Castelnau ordered counterattacks to push the Germans back from the Meuse, and something happened that France was not supposed to experience until 1917. Regiments ordered up the slopes against dug-in German guns began to refuse. Not mutiny as rebellion, no officers shot, no red flags, but the weary collective refusal of men who had watched Verdun fall and no longer believed attacks could work. The mutinies of 1917 arriving a year early, born of the same causes, hopelessness and squandered lives. Pétain understood, as he would have understood in any timeline, that the cure was not firing squads but rest, leave, and the visible refusal to waste men. Meanwhile, Falkenhayn faced his own dilemma. His victory was real, but his strategy was gone. He had wanted a mangle, not a salient. Pushed toward the Champagne rail lines, and he risked the overstretch that had broken every German offensive since the Marne. And Germany's margins were thinner than the maps in Berlin suggested. On June 4th, Brusilov's offensive, planned under the same Chantilly commitments, independent of anything at Verdun, tore open the Austrian front in Galicia, and German reserves that might have exploited the Meuse went east instead. The blockade still tightened. The victory at Verdun changed the war's story. It did not change its arithmetic. With the joint offensive dead, Haig improvised. In late June, the British Expeditionary Force attacked in Picardy anyway, a smaller, hastier operation than the Great Somme offensive of our timeline, launched not to break through but to pull German reserves away from a tottering ally. The new conscript divisions of Kitchener's army went forward against uncut wire and deep dugouts, and the cost was heavy and the gain was small. Yet the attack's true significance lay in what it forced London and Paris to say out loud. In cabinet rooms and embassy corridors, the unspoken question finally surfaced. If French morale did not recover, if a shaken government in Paris ever sought terms, did Britain fight on alone? The honest answer was that it could. The Royal Navy still commanded the seas. The blockade was slowly strangling German industry and German kitchens. The new armies were still growing. But a Britain fighting alone would be fighting a different war, a war of years and starvation rather than offensives. That answer, whispered in London, was also heard in Paris. And it mattered because it told France that holding on still meant something. And then came the question that would define everything that followed. What does a nation fight for once its symbol is gone? Here is the paradox at the heart of this timeline. In our history, Verdun's meaning was not built into its walls, it was created by its defense. 300 days of resistance, the voix sacré's endless trucks, the phrase "they shall not pass," these transformed a shattered town of no great strategic weight into the reason France endured, the proof it gave itself that it could not be broken. Falkenhayn's attrition machine bled Germany nearly as white as France, and the legend it accidentally forged carried the French army through the real crisis of 1917. In this timeline, the town fell in a week, and France was spared the ossuary of 300,000 dead, but denied the story. The military position on the left bank of the Meuse was defensible. Rivers, railways, and artillery still favored the defender, and Germany, pinned by Brusilov in the east and starved by the blockade at sea, could not turn one captured city into a decided war. What hung in the balance was not ground but belief. Whether a republic that had lost its fortress could find another reason to hold, in its alliance, in its anger, in the simple refusal to let the sacrifice be for nothing. Nations do not endure wars because their fortresses hold. Fortresses hold because nations decide to endure, and at Verdun, in any timeline, that decision was always the real battle.